Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for Klansman by Ron Stallworth. This is a nonfiction account of Ron Stallworth's time as a police officer in Colorado Springs, heading an investigation to infiltrate the KKK. I read this for the Crime Scene Read-Along hosted by Cammie's Corner and Joni Reads, where we read a true crime book every other month, and this was our selection for September. I gave this book 3 stars, although I was kind of on the fence over whether it deserved 2 or 3. I wound up giving it the benefit of the doubt because I did think it was a cool concept and something that I was interested to learn about. The main problem with this book for me was the writing. Ron Stallworth is not a writer. I mean, he literally is now that he's written this book, but he's not a writer by trade. He was a cop who went through an interesting event and wanted to write about it. And you can tell. And this was one of those books that really feels like it should have been ghostwritten or co-written. Because as you read a lot of nonfiction books by people who aren't writers, who either get a ghostwriter or who get someone to co-write, while they kind of dictate their story and the other author just polishes it up and turns it into a book. This really does feel like Ron Stallworth wrote this whole book by himself, which is impressive, but also one of those things that was a detriment in the long run. The first problem with the writing is the sentences. There are so many long, convoluted, run-on sentences in this book that every page I thought of an example. I was like, oh, this would be a good example to read. That would be a good example to read. But honestly, I'm gonna go with the second sentence of the book, which is just on the back. And it's not the worst example of this, but I do feel like it holds particular power, being that it's literally the second sentence of this book. As an intelligence unit detective for the Colorado Springs Police Department, the first black detective in the history of the department, I might add, one of my duties was to scan the 2 daily newspapers for any reports of information concerning any hint of subversive activity that might have an impact on the welfare and safety of Colorado Springs. That's literally just one sentence, the second sentence in the book. And most of the sentences were written like that. They would just go on and contain so much information, so many different points, and be written in this weird convoluted way that I would have to stop and think about them to decipher them. And it made this book really a drag to get through because it's only 188 pages, but I was honestly struggling to get through this book in 2 days. I thought I would just fly through it because it sounds really cool. And it went on and on forever, it felt like. And those sentences just, some of them were never ending. That's obviously not the worst example, it's just the first example that I came up with. He wrote them honestly like he was writing a police report, like everything needed to be technically correct, so he would phrase things in various different ways to get his point across, and it just did not work. Like for a police report, sure, but for a book which is meant to be read for enjoyment, not so much. And the other problem was how many quotation marks he used. And I'm not talking about in dialogue, that's different, but like the way we use air quotes, we use it for slang or euphemisms or things we don't agree with. And he just used so many, like literally so many. There was almost one every single page, and on some pages I counted 10 or more. It was just excessive, and he used them so frequently and for like words that really didn't need them, like wannabe. Wannabe is like a normal word, like they're a wannabe. You don't need to put it in quotes. I could literally turn to any page in this book and come up with at least one example of that. Like any page at random to illustrate. Let's just open it up here. They just laughed it off as Miller being Miller. Was apparently normal. Are there any more? Or was that it? I expressed to Mr. Duke. Like, literally a random page, and there were just 2 on that page. I could have picked a page that had 10 if I was just, specifically writing down a page number. But, literally just that random page, and I'm not talking about the 2 pages that were back to back. Just that one single page had 2, the other page had 1, and it's just, every single page in this book had at least 1, and it was so excessive. I've never seen an author use that many quotation marks that weren't for dialogue. I also just found this book kind of boring. I thought he'd have to work really hard to cram this entire story into just 188 pages, but it kind of felt like he was struggling to fill those pages. Like, this is a very short book, but he repeated so much information, and he would repeat like things that happened, and he'd repeat it 40 pages later. And I was like, why are you telling me this again? Or he'd constantly remind you that even though Chuck was the one going undercover, he, Ron Stallworth, was in charge of the investigation, like every page. And I'm like, I get it, bro. You wrote this book. Like, I understand that you're in charge of this investigation and that Chuck is only speaking for you. You don't have to tell me every single time Chuck speaks. It was excessive. And it was just that, like, nothing happened in this book. And I understand that this was an intelligence operation. He wasn't trying to prevent any crimes. Well, they were trying to prevent crimes in the sense that, like, they were talking the KKK out of doing crimes. But it was just intelligence. They were trying to figure out what the KKK was planning, what was going on, everything like that. It was an intelligence gathering operation. So there were no arrests. There was, like, no dramatic climax. Nothing really dramatic happened. And I would have been fine with that if he'd gone in depth on, like, the investigation itself, or if he'd gone in depth on what they learned from the KKK, or if he'd gone in depth on how the KKK was structured, or anything. Like, if he'd, like, really delved deeply into one subject, it wouldn't have mattered that, like, nothing happened in this book, because it would have had a purpose. But this was sort of just, like, one of those stories you tell, like, hey, man, you know what's really funny? I know this black guy who went undercover with the KKK. Like, that's a hilarious story. And it didn't feel like there was much else going on in this book. Like, if he'd focused on something or given us in-depth information on, like, anything that was happening, but it just kind of felt like an overview. Like, the most in-depth he got was, like, on his own thoughts. And I didn't learn anything new about the KKK or undercover investigations or anything like that. Like, as far as the Ku Klux Klan goes, it pretty much as in-depth as he got was that they were racist and kind of dumb, which, like, is what I already knew. I don't know much information on them, and this book didn't really add to that. I expected more of like a deep dive into their beliefs and how the organization worked or was structured or anything, but it wasn't. It was just, hey, I was a black man and I decided to infiltrate the KKK. Isn't that cool? And like, yeah, that's cool. Like, that's hilarious. And he really captured the humor in that, which I thought was kind of wonderful. But there wasn't super much there that was particularly enjoyable for me to read. And I also did see the movie before I read this book. I watched the movie a few months back. I don't remember too many specifics from it, but I enjoyed the movie. And after the movie was over, I googled what was true and what wasn't, because the movie hit on like melodrama that very clearly wasn't true. So I just googled what wasn't true, and there was a lot of manufactured drama in it. But honestly, if you take out the manufactured drama of that movie, it was the same story. Like, without the romantic subplot, without the explosions and the bomb threats, without them specifically targeting Ron Stallworth, the black cop, it was the same exact story. So honestly, I'd recommend just watching the movie and giving this book a pass, and then after the movie's over, just like Google what didn't happen. And that way you get the story of what actually happened, but it's also told to you in an entertaining and fun way. And I think Spike Lee really captured the humor of this book really well, and having watched the movie first, it did help me enjoy the book more because I could hear his voice as the main actor from that film. And that made it more enjoyable. Like, I got more of the humor, I think, because of that. But overall, like, there just wasn't that much here. Like, for 188 pages, short books can be really powerful. But this one kind of felt like it could have been an essay, and I wouldn't have really missed out on too much. I am glad I read it though. Like, it was cool to get the actual real story of what happened, which was not that dramatic, but was still interesting. And it was interesting to learn about the time period of the 80s and what it was like, because I was born in the 90s, and I was not really aware of any time period until the 2000s. So it was cool to learn a lot more about, like, racial politics of the time, and he made a lot of comparisons between then and today and what it was like and what has changed and what hasn't changed that I really appreciated. And I am glad I read this book. I gave it 3 stars, I think, because of that. I didn't actively dislike it, but I don't know how much I would recommend it. Maybe if you are just like incredibly fascinated by the idea of a black cop going undercover to infiltrate the KKK, but I don't know. I think I would just recommend the movie and then Google afterwards to see what was true, because there just wasn't a whole lot to this book. Let me know down below if you've read BlacKkKlansman and what you thought of it if you have. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.